So today we're going to talk about what I advertised on last Thursday as the backstory behind the South African transition, or at least part of the backstory that involved business. And this is the first of several classes in the second half of the course where we're going to turn the lights up on business. We talked a lot about the declining fortunes of labor in this course and how that's played out in politics. But we haven't spent much time on business, just generally treating it as a black box. Obviously, the relative power of business has increased in the capitalist world since the collapse of communism, and that's brought new dynamics. It also, as a normative matter, tends, when capitalism is the only game in town, it tends to make the old Marxist critiques of capitalism a little beside the point. And the more interesting questions about business and capital are, what are the conditions under which they play a progressive role in politics? What are the conditions under which they play a predatory role in politics? And how might they be shifted from a less predatory role of the sort we saw in Russia in particular? How might business be induced to play more constructive roles in politics, even in very difficult politics? So that's one theme that's going to come back several times in the latter part of the course. But let's begin by going back to Johannesburg in the 1990s.
All of a sudden, I saw the security people running out, and I said, "What's up?" And they said, they've broken through and they're coming. And then my own security man simply grabbed hold of me and ran.
Pandemonium just broke out in the entire building. Many people on the ANC side, from the government side, all huddled into the government offices. We thought the right-wingers would never dare just march into government offices and start accosting people or assaulting them. And in fact, we even feared that we would be shot at.
The AWB overwhelmed the police, who retreated before them.
Signs of glass and everything shattering and everything, and reports coming through that they are looking for us, particularly Rolf and Cyril.
Terrified delegates barricaded themselves in their offices. In the conference chamber, the AWB chanted and daubed slogans demanding a separate white state. Soon after the invasion, the negotiators agreed that an election should be held the following April. With the ANC growing in confidence and looking certain to win the election, the National Party had retreated bit by bit on nearly all its power-sharing demands. As the conference wound up with the ANC triumphant, Ramaphosa celebrated his 41st birthday.
I was able to see Rolf Meyer for the first time dancing on the floor where we were having this party. He was quite happy, he was quite jovial, and I kept wondering whether I would have been as happy as he was if I was in his position, having finally given in the way that they had.
Key National Party negotiators were satisfied they had struck a workable deal with an adversary they had grown to trust. Now the election could proceed. Terra Blanche threw all his weight into stopping the election. He summoned a rally at the Pretoria Monument to the Afrikaner pioneers. He said if Mandela wanted war, he would get war. Terra Blanche then persuaded the Volksfront to boycott and oppose the election.
Ons het nie nodig om te verduidelik dat ons wit is. God het ons so gemaak en trou as sy kinders staan ons daarby. Ons graaf meneer die voorsitter het nie nodig om grond te vra. Ons het grond. Ons is die beskawers van Suid-Afrika. Ons is nie bereid om in 'n verkiesing in te gaan waar die ANC die boere se koppe tel.
Pretty frightening stuff, you might think. The reason I put it up there is just to emphasize that when Mandela and de Klerk negotiated their agreement, that was not the end of the matter. It was, to quote a Churchillism, it was the end of the beginning. And there was a lot that had to happen for the transition actually to be consummated. And it was enormously fragile. And I'm just going to walk you through a bit of a timeline to give you a sense of how fragile it was. We saw last Thursday that on the 2nd of February 1990, the government announced it was unilaterally freeing all political prisoners, unbanning all organizations, and planning to negotiate with the ANC. 3 months later, the ANC unilaterally suspended its armed struggle and began serious negotiations. That led in December 1991 and then May of 1992 to 2 rounds of roundtable negotiations, the so-called CODESA, Conference on a Democratic South Africa negotiations, where all of the stakeholders, there were 19 stakeholders initially, all the political parties, all social movements had a seat at the table as a way of trying to negotiate the transition to democracy. As I said to you in the last lecture, a democratic path to democracy is difficult because a democratic political order is a public good, and it's very difficult to do that, to provide them democratically. And indeed, there were people and groups that didn't want to see this transition. The far right we've talked about, and we'll see today, other groups were not so interested in seeing this transition to a unified democratic South Africa. So they became spoilers, and they perpetually interrupted the negotiations, stonewalled the settlement, and in May of 1992, they were sort of reconstituted, having been floundering since the previous year. But a month later, there was a massacre at a place called Boipatong, which where about 45 people were shot dead, apparently, allegedly, by Zulu supporters of the Inkatha Freedom Party, an ethnic separatist party that I'll tell you more about shortly. But it was widely believed that the South African security police were behind the scenes involved in the Boipatong massacre. The result was CODESA collapsed, and the violence escalated dramatically, and so dramatically that the ANC and the government started having secret talks. But they weren't really secret. Everybody knew they were going on. I was in South Africa that year. Every day on the evening news, there would be reports of what had gone on in the secret talks between the ANC and the government. And eventually, they signed a deal, an elite pact, if you like, in September that was called a Record of Understanding about how things would move forward. This then led them to create something called a multi-party negotiating forum. And in the multi-party negotiating forum, basically the ANC and the government told the other players what was going to happen to give them time to accommodate themselves and adjust. But they did not really treat it anymore as a multi-party negotiation. As far as the government and the ANC was concerned, it was a done deal, and people had to get with the program, so to speak, or be left behind. Later in that same month, a young, charismatic ANC member, and very much on the more radical flank of the ANC, was assassinated. Chris Hani, extremely charismatic, also in the Communist Party, and the result of this, he was assassinated by a right, I think it was Polish extraction, white South African. And the whole country seemed to be on the verge of exploding. The violence escalated hugely, and the talks were in danger again of falling apart. And I put up on the slide there that the election date was set. And the reason for that was that Mandela and Ramaphosa came to de Klerk eventually and said that the only way they could tamp down the violence was if it was a non-negotiably agreed that the election would take place within a year of Chris Harney's death. So that the election had to be held in April of 1994 became a hard deadline, if you like, a non-negotiable item, and that turned out to be important later. Realizing that they had been handed a fait accompli, Buthelezi, who was the head of this Inkatha Freedom Party, walked out of the talks, and essentially the multi-party negotiating forum collapsed at that point. And true to the divided dollar story we've been talking about earlier in the course, even though he was the leader of the ethnic Zulu party, he joined forces with the right-wing Afrikaans whites and also the heads of the traditional homelands, sort of Bantustans, who saw themselves as losing their power in the new South Africa, and they announced that they were going to be boycotting the elections. And that was important because most people who know a little bit about the South African conflict know the story behind this pie chart, that, as you can see, the black African majority of the country was 79%, whites were fewer than 10%, and the rest were mixed race or Indians and Asian groups. What is less well known outside of the South African context is the ethnic breakdown of the non-white population. And there you can see that Zulu were a plurality of 28%, but the next greatest group, almost 20%, were the Xhosa. And why this matters is that the Xhosa were more or less 100% committed to the ANC. The ANC probably won, not 100%, but over 90% of their vote. But the Zulu were deeply divided nationally between the ANC and Inkatha. But in the eastern part of the country, which was then called Natal, today is called KwaZulu-Natal, they control the majority of the Zulu vote, the Inkatha Freedom Party. And so from Buthelezi's point of view, a much better outcome would have been a partition at the end of the day of some sort where Inkatha could be in a majority and so actually control what is today KwaZulu-Natal. So he didn't really want a transition to a country in which all the polls told them that the ANC would win a 2/3 overall national majority. And so Buthelezi here was not just, even though we talk about the deal between the ANC and the government, Buthelezi was the potential spoiler of this settlement. And why did this matter? It mattered because the civil war in Natal would have made the transition impossible. The levels of violence by 1992 in KwaZulu-Natal had already reached Civil War proportions. And the notion that the country could really have a successful election, which was boycotted by Inkatha, was not credible. And so it was a huge problem going forward. So just going back to the timeline, in June 1993, one of the far right-wing groups torpedoed the negotiations yet again, similar to the clip I showed you, but a different meeting in Kempton Park. They just drove armored vehicles through the plate glass windows and constantly were trying to upset and harass the negotiators. All of the time, this election that had to occur in April of 1994, lest the deal between the government and the ANC come unstuck, was approaching. And indeed, a month before the election in March, it all came to a head in one of the homelands. The homelands had been sometimes called Bantustans. As I said, these were the nominally independent states under apartheid's migrant labor system. Violence exploded when the leader of one of these said he was not participating in the election, and some of the right-wing Afrikaners went ostensibly to support him in the hope that this would precipitate a military coup, that the military would get behind the uprising in Bophuthatswana, and there would be a takeover, and the impending election would be stamped out. And so there were these people went there in paramilitary uniforms. A lot of people were killed, including 4 white Afrikaners were killed, and it was filmed on national television and shown over and over again. And it really seemed, this is now we're a month before the election, it seemed like the whole world was going up in smoke. If you think about April 1994, those of you who are old enough to remember, this is when the Rwandan genocide was in full swing to the north. These are the kinds of pictures that South Africans were seeing on television and in the newspapers every night. So the idea that, that you could have some horrific bloodbath it wasn't an academic thought. It was was seeing it every night on the evening news. And just literally weeks before the election, 3 weeks before the election, this is what was happening in Johannesburg.
Johannesburg, the commercial heart of South Africa, paralyzed by gunfire and fear. Chaos erupted on the streets as thousands of Zulu supporters of the Inkatha Freedom Party protested against the election. The rattle of AK-47s echoed around the banks of the business district as security forces tried to keep control. Tear gas and stun grenades filled the normally quiet squares. There were running gun battles as police tried to force back gun-wielding demonstrators using rubber bullets and buckshot. At least 8 people were killed by African National Congress guards when the Inkatha crowds reportedly tried to attack the ANC headquarters. Bodies littered the streets as mayhem brought central Johannesburg to a standstill.
So it didn't look like we were 3 weeks from a democratic national election. And at that point, Henry Kissinger and Lord Carrington of Britain were brought in to try and mediate a solution. They spent all of 2.5 days there, concluded the situation was hopeless, packed up and left. And so then again, the newspapers were just full of portent of failures. This is an article which you can peruse at your leisure, but basically detailing the way in which Zulu militias were preparing to escalate the civil war. And then, miraculously, we turn on the evening news, and this is what we hear.
In South Africa, a breakthrough may be imminent to stem recent political violence. Political leaders appear to have found a way to end the standoff over the country's first all-race elections. Another meeting is set for Tuesday to finalize the deal. CNN's Peter Arnett reports.
Following 6 hours of talks in Pretoria aimed at ending a major political standoff in South Africa, the official line was guardedly optimistic.
Our talks today have gone very well.
So well, in fact, that sources tell CNN that details of a plan to bring the Zulus into the election have been okayed by negotiators for the government and for the Zulu chief. And a document has been drawn up that must now only be approved by ANC leader Nelson Mandela. And
Mandela did approve the document, and the election went forward, and Inkatha did indeed not boycott the election, and it occurred as planned on the 27th of April 1994. The ANC won almost more than 62.5% of the vote. The National Party came in second, and Inkatha came in with 10.5% of the vote, and enough votes to get control of the regional legislature in the new KwaZulu-Natal, as well as 3 seats in the cabinet. And so that's the timeline up through the election. Today's agenda is to talk about business and the backstory. You can see just from what I went through, there were many points at which this might have fallen apart. And business had a great deal to do with why it didn't. And in the course of considering the role of business in this transition, we're going to revisit some of our earlier briefer and glancing visits with modernization theory, and look at what we should think about business's attitudes toward authoritarian and democratic systems. And then we'll also, part of our theme is to think about the role not only that business played during this crisis, but also before and after, to get a more panoramic historical sense. So, just to be clear as to what I'm saying and what I'm not saying, I'm not arguing, and it wouldn't be plausible to argue, that business caused the transition from apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was caused by many things, not least the negotiations we talked about last time between leaders, and not least the activities of the liberation movement. Business, however, did have a great deal to do with the fact that the transition was peaceful, substantially peaceful, and that it ended up in a democracy. That is to say, it is clear that apartheid's days were numbered. The status quo as it existed in South Africa in the 1980s was not going to survive. But that didn't mean you were going to end up with a democracy. There could have been a military coup, there could have been an ongoing civil war, there could have been multiple other outcomes. There could have just been a massive crackdown of an apartheid authoritarian state. So the role that business played was in facilitating a peaceful transition to a democracy rather than some other more bloody denouement. And I'm going to focus on 4 areas where business had an impact. The first is in getting negotiations started in the first place. By the time Mandela, in the late 1980s, was secretly talking to de Klerk in messages, there had various things had actually been going on for some time that made it propitious for those talks to begin, and I'll say something about that. Then I'm going to talk about the role business played in actually brokering the deals between the government and the ANC initially, and then between the two of them and Inkatha toward the end. I'm going to talk about the role business played in managing potential spoilers. When I put that stylized diagram up of transition negotiations last time, I mentioned that the people on the flanks of the government and the opposition, potential spoilers, had to be convinced, co-opted, or marginalized if the transition is not to be scuttled. And business played a role in that. And then I also mentioned that it's very important in the conversations about from above and from below to build support for the new dispensation, which does not have a constituency in the old order because it's a deeply polarized situation. So those will be the 4 areas that we'll focus on. Now, let's go back to the 1970s. This is the National Party had come to power in 1948. It had spent much of the 1960s creating the apartheid order with compulsory segregation, forced removals of Africans from the cities into these homelands where they then worked as migrant laborers. And by the 1970s, it was firmly established. The government had been in power for more than a decade. There was no meaningful white opposition party, and they seemed to be entrenched. In a setting like that, why might business decide that it should start talking to the leadership of the liberation movement? Liberation movement was illegal. It was underground. After 1963, many of them were, including Mandela, were in prison, and Jacob Zuma. Others were like Mbeki, were in exile in London or elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Why would business leaders, I'm talking about big business, white big business, why would they want to start talking to the leadership of the liberation movement? Yeah.
Thinking about like business people.
You got it.
Hi. No?
Well, just yell.
Okay. Like from a business perspective, 80% of the population, if you empower that 80% of the population, have a bigger market to sell.
Okay, so business might have a bigger market if they could do better business. And there was certainly a view that apartheid produced inefficient labor markets and so on. We'll come back to that. But we should notice this is quite unusual. Typically in authoritarian systems, business does not get involved in politics. If we look at China, business, when we talked about the rule of law in China and so on, business might go to court over business issues, but typically they keep their heads low in politics in authoritarian systems. You know, they may be interested in the market, but that doesn't mean you have to have a democracy to sell in the South African market. And indeed, Carlos Bosch, who I put up on an earlier slide when we were talking about modernization theory, his argument about his modern version of modernization theory, if you go back and look at that slide, you'll see I had him on the slide which said modernization comes as a result of pressure from below. And so this might seem inconsistent with what I'm about to say now, but it's not, because the way, and many people have made this argument, I'm just giving him as an illustration, is the thought was that in an authoritarian setting, business is going to resist democratization until they think they're pretty sure they can leave. It's a Hirschman story. So if I think I can't leave, and I give everybody the vote, it's the median voter problem. They're going to tax me. They're going to expropriate my assets once they have the votes. So I have a strong incentive to resist democratization. But if I can leave with my capital and with my assets, then the threat of exit, my threat of exit, makes it less likely that they will be willing to risk the economy's future by taxing me. So this variant of modernization, as I said, it assumes the pressure to democratize is coming from below, but the argument is business is going to line up with authoritarian systems so long as there's what economists refer to as high asset specificity. That is, you can't take it with you. If it's a world revolving around human capital, I can just walk out of the door with my human capital in my cranium. And set up shop elsewhere. But if what I own is a gold mine, I can't take the gold mine with me, right? I can't take the diamond mines with me, right? And so this is why it seems counterintuitive, at least from the standpoint of those traditional theories, it seems counterintuitive that business would actually favor an opening to the liberation movement, because very high asset specificity. They were big business was invested in big mining and the diamond mining and so on. They were also invested elsewhere in the economy, but they didn't have much credible capacity to threaten exit. And so that's initially a puzzle, and we'll come back to it. But it means that there must have been sticks and carrots. There must have been sticks to make business think that they needed to start talking, and there must have also been carrots to make it look appealing. And I want to start with the sticks. Sticks matter because things, if people don't have to change, they're probably not going to change, for the most part. Particularly, I said most politicians are risk averse, and most business people also are risk averse in that sense. They might want to take business risks, but they're not going to get involved in trying to shape the political future unless they start to feel that the status quo is, as what an economist would call, a wasting asset, that things are changing in ways that are not likely to be good for them. So what could the sticks have been? Yeah. Sanctions. Okay, so sanctions, the difficulty with sanctions, and this was the era of boycotts, this is disinvestment. David Swenson, who's managed the Yale Endowment since 1985, will tell you a story if you have lunch with him, that he came to Yale from Wall Street in 1985, and he went to the investment office, and he found it occupied by anti-apartheid student demonstrators. And he said, right then I knew I'd left Wall Street. So there were boycotts. They were passed over Reagan's veto. The truth about sanctions is that they don't work, though. Industrial sanctions don't work, and in South Africa they didn't work because, you know, Kodak left, but AGFA came. Ford left, but Toyota came. And indeed, the sanctions led to stimulation of the indigenous capital markets and the growth of the South African economy. So industrial sanctions didn't really make any difference. I'll come back to financial sanctions in a bit. But a principal stick here was that South Africa had illegal black trade unions. They had outlawed black trade unions under apartheid. And this hadn't mattered that much to business because there had been labor quiescence through the 1970s, as you can see from that slide. There'd been almost no industrial action. In the early 1970s, that starts to change, and although it's child's play compared to what's coming later, as you can see, if you look at what happened in the 1980s, as compared with what they were used to, there were these big outbreaks of wildcat strikes, and the mine owners didn't know who was running them, and they wanted to be able to negotiate with them. They wanted to be able to negotiate industrial peace because they were trying to run the mine. So in the first instance, they wanted unions to be legalized so that they could have basically a corporatist arrangement where the management and labor could negotiate industrial deals and they could be enforced by the government. The government was strongly opposed to this for the obvious reason that with all political opposition illegal, if you legalized unions, they would become magnets for political activism. The mine owners said, yes, we know that, but we should do this. We have to do this. We can't run the mines. And there was something of a standoff for several years in the mid-1970s, but eventually the business leaders beat the government into submission. And something called the Vihan Commission was appointed that was nominally going to look at it, but it was run by a man, Vihan, who was an academic who was known to be a supporter of legal trade unions for blacks. Anglo-American, the biggest multinational in South Africa and one of the biggest in the world at that time, actually had someone on the Vihan Commission. It recommended the legalization of trade unions, and they became, indeed, magnets for political activism. And many people criticized Anglo-American and big business for having supported this, but they did it anyway. And from a point of view of the economy, it worked for them. They did have to deal with very dramatic strikes later, but they did create this is a development at first the National Mine Workers Union, then something called COSATU, the Conference of South African Trade Unions. One of the most powerful union movements in the world was finally created, and certainly one of the most powerful union movements in the world today. So that turned out to be important. It also led to the development of relationships, personal relationships between business leaders and people who were widely represented in the liberation movement, something that had not previously existed. I said that industrial sanctions didn't work. The same was not true of financial sanctions. In the mid-1980s, amidst all the pressure, eventually Chase and Citibank refused to roll over South Africa's debt, and they couldn't pay it. And so there was a massive run on the banks and huge capital outflows, and that created a crisis in the financial sector that was not resolved. What the leaders, and you can see this if you go on the case and look at the interview with Sidney Frankel, now deceased, they responded to this by running junkets of bringing business people to the country to try and convince them that South Africa was worth investing in, that they shouldn't leave, and they had set up meetings for them with government officials and took them around plants and so forth, and weekends in Kruger National Park. And they also had them meet with leaders of the liberation movement, which the government didn't like, but they tolerated it. It was a complete failure from the point of view of either stopping capital outflows or in bringing capital in. But again, it was a way in which leaders of the South African financial sector developed personal relationships with people in the liberation movement that would turn out to be important later. These relationships were built, and they had the effect of breaking down the barriers, at least at the elite level, between the leaders of the liberation movement and the leaders of both the big mining companies and South Africa's financial sector. What about carrots? Why might carrots matter? Carrots are important because even if people think the status quo is not an option anymore, they may nonetheless dig in their heels. So for instance, in the 1960s and 70s in Rhodesia, as it then was, the white farmers didn't see any good future, and so they dug in behind Ian Smith's government until the very end, until basically the British pulled the plug on him. We're going to talk more about Israel-Palestine in a few classes from now. But I can't tell you how many Israeli businessmen I have interviewed who say, the status quo is terrible, we hate it, it sucks, and the alternatives are all worse. And they mean it. They believe that's how the world looks to them. So in addition to thinking that the status quo is bad, maybe even untenable, people have to be able to see a possible future that has some appeal, at least greater appeal than the status quo. And the important thing here was the collapse of communism. Because the leadership of the ANC and the leadership of the South African Communist Party had pretty much been the same people, the same actual individuals, people like Joe Slovo. And believe me, these people were not like Euro-communists in expensive Italian suits. Just to give you a sense of what kind of communist party it was, during that coup in Moscow, a failed coup in Moscow that I talked about in the first class on the collapse of the Soviet Union, those 3 days when Gorbachev was locked up in his dacha on the Black Sea, 3 communist parties in the world recognized the coup, one of which was the good old SACP. So these were hardline Stalinist communists, and known to be such, widely known to be such. And In fact, the leader of the South African Communist Party, Bram Fischer, had been an Afrikaner judge and the son of the state president, and was caught and horribly tortured for the rest of his life in prison. So, you know, the gloves were off with the communists, and people, and as far as white business elites were concerned, the big fear was that if you had a transition to majority rule, there would be communism, right? The ANC and the South African Communist Party were one and the same thing from their point of view. Once communism started to go off the table, that reality changed. As one businessman I interviewed put it, he said, "I woke up one day and I realized we do not have to be Cuba. We can be Brazil." And that when that light bulb went off for him, it was an epiphany, because they suddenly realized that there was a possible future for them in a new order. And particularly once you see the status quo is collapsing, you want to get to a better future if once you can see that possibility. So an important fact about South African business is that the ownership of the economy was highly concentrated at this time. Mining had long been dominated by a small number of huge companies, Anglo-American and De Beers being the two most important. Just to give you a sense, in 1985, Anglo controlled more than half of the capitalization of the whole Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and the top 5 corporate groups controlled 80% of it. Concentration in manufacturing had been increasing since the 70s, and by 1985, the largest 5% of firms contributed at least 50% of output. So even though the South African economy is not an oil curse kind of a story, it was a pretty diversified economy. It was owned by a small number of large conglomerates. Mike Spicer, who is the general manager of Anglo that I interviewed in one of those videos, which you can see in the case, he said you could get 9 people around a table, would have been 9 men. You could get 9 men around a table, and you basically had the whole South African economy there. So this is just, again, you can peruse this at your leisure, but this captures the conglomerate quality of Anglo, all the bits and pieces of it that it owned and its subsidiaries. Why did that matter? It mattered because it meant that business could act together. This is a picture of what economists have, or political economists have referred to as a K group. So if you have a lot of actors who need to do something together, there's a collective action problem, right? How do you get them to coordinate and pay the costs of coordinating to provide some good from which they will all benefit? It's a classic collective action problem for which Mansur Olson is famous. So the idea of a K group is if there's a subgroup within that group that has the quality that if they can solve their own collective action problems within the subgroup and provide the collective good, it's worth it to them to let everybody else free ride. The benefits of providing it for them are such that it's worth it to let everybody else free ride. So these big corporate players like Anglo and De Beers and Barlow Rand and the other major companies formed a K group. And they could meet in somebody's house and talk about what business was going to do. And that made it possible, first to solve their collective action problem, but it also made it possible for them to intimidate the government. If you read Adam Tooze, our former colleague, sadly lost to Columbia, his fantastically good Economic History of the Third Reich, The Wages of Destruction, you know, part of Tooze's story is that when German big business started giving Hitler trouble, he threw a couple of people in prison and everybody else fell into line. A bit like the story of Putin and Khodorkovsky that I talked to you about earlier. I think it would be too much to say that in the 1980s, the South African government were country bumpkins. But they basically, their big base of voter support was Afrikaans farmers. They were not very involved in the commercial sector. That changed over the course of the 1980s. Afrikaners began moving in significant numbers into the corporate sector. But certainly at the beginning of the 1980s, if they had tried to take over Anglo-American, the government wouldn't have had the first clue as to what to do with it. So business was in a strategically strong position vis-a-vis the government, and they could act together. The big players could set the tone and maybe the terms of what was going to happen. And they had a double agenda. They wanted, first of all, not to have a civil war or some massive repressive outcome that would be horrific to live in. But they also, so they wanted a transition, and they maybe thought some kind of transition was more or less inevitable. But they also wanted to have a big influence on the ANC. Because the ANC, who were the ANC leaders? After all, they were either they were even in prison on Robben Island, Mandela and his friends, or, you know, they were scattered around, some in London, some in East Europe. What they knew about economics, they had learned from reading, you know, summaries of Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto in East European guerrilla training camps. And the leaders of South African business knew this. So what they wanted to do was to, you know, they like everybody else were reading The Economist every week and drinking up the Washington Consensus and all of that, South African business. They wanted the new South Africa to be part of that new story. And so a big part of their agenda was to influence the ANC. So this was a dual agenda, to be handmaidens for a peaceful transition to democracy and to disabuse the ANC of its traditional positions, which were about nationalizing the commanding heights of the economy. And so they acted first. In 1985, the head of Anglo-American, Gavin Relly, just went to Lusaka and met with the leadership of the ANC in exile himself. And the government was furious. They criticized him and they attacked him, but they couldn't stop him. When student groups and church groups and others said, we're going to do it too, they said, we'll throw you in jail if you do that. But they didn't stop the business groups. And this became known as the Lusaka Trek. These business elites started going backwards and forwards to Lusaka and to Mozambique, and eventually a whole second set of business leaders started meeting, thanks to Consgold, Consolidated Gold Company in London, with the leadership in exile in London. And so they started having these talks. And they then also decided they had better start talking to the ANC, underground ANC in the country. The ANC was banned, but there was a front organization called the United Democratic Front, the UDF, and they started having secret meetings with them in people's living rooms. This is stuff for which you could be thrown in prison without trial for 90 days and then later for 180 days. And what they would do, they would throw you in prison for 90 days or 180 days without trial, and as you were walking out the door, they would throw you in for another 180 days without trial. There were people who were in there for years. Many years under these detention laws. So these people were taking huge risks meeting with the leaders of the UDF in the mid-1980s. And after a while, the UDF got, you know, irritated with this. They say, well, you know, it's cool to have nice conversations in people's living rooms, but we need an organization to deal with. We need you to form a group. And so eventually they did. They formed this group called the Consultative Business Movement in 1988. And what was hugely important about this group was that they were the first group of white elites to say, we favor majority rule democracy for South Africa, one person, one vote. Because all the white parties, the government, including the official white opposition, had been talking about power sharing deals, vetoes for minority groups, the educational qualifications for the franchise, you name it. But the CBM was the first group to say, we are for a normal, as ANC had kept calling it, we want a normal democracy in South Africa. And so that solved their credibility problem. They didn't say we're neutral about the politics. They said we're committed to a democratic transition and we will work to bring it about. And that meant they were the only credible brokers. Church groups were all allied with different political parties. There was nobody else that could be credible brokers between the government and the ANC. And so, just to give you one poignant illustration of how they broke it, this is a famous Sidney Frankel story. He thought it was important that the two chief negotiators, the two deputies of the ANC and the government, should get to know each other. They turned out to be the two chief negotiators, Ramaphosa and South African Deputy President Rolf Meyer. So he took them fishing on his trout farm. He arranged for them to be brought in helicopters and so forth. So the story goes, they went fishing and Ramaphosa got a fish hook stuck in his finger. And I'm sorry, Meyer got a fish hook stuck in his finger. And Ramaphosa said, I know how to fix that. Bring me some pliers and a bottle of brandy. And they did, and he said, now you drink the brandy, give me the pliers, but you have to trust me. And so the story goes that this was the bonding moment between, who knows whether it's true, but it stands for the proposition that the business elites were facilitating the personal interaction between the government and the ANC. They formed the Consultative Business Movement, as I've said to you, and then once the CODESA talks were planned, there was no other group that could be trusted to function as a secretariat for the groups, for the CODESA talks. So the CBM became essentially the convener of the roundtable talks among the 19 parties. And when CODESA 1 collapsed, it was the CBM people who did all the running around to get CBM reconstituted the following May, as CODESA reconstituted the following May as CODESA 2. And when CODESA 2 collapsed, after Boipatong and all that, it was they who became the back channel walkers in the woods, so to speak, keeping the conversation going. So hugely important role that business played in convening the talks and then picking up the pieces when they fell apart. So managing spoilers. I talked earlier about the Kissinger-Carrington visit. That was also organized at the behest of the CBM. But more importantly, once it fell apart, it was then the Consultative Business Movement people who decided that they had to act to pick up the pieces. And if you look at the interviews with Colin Coleman in the video, Colin Coleman's an interesting man. He was an architecture student at Wits, University of Witwatersrand, who came of age. He just graduated in the mid-1980s and was the first full-time employee of the CBM. And they hired him right out of college to work in facilitating the talks with the ANC. Today, he's, by the way, is the head of Goldman Sachs for Sub-Saharan Africa. But in those days, he was actually a member of the ANC, young ANC member, although he was white, it was unusual. And so he had a certain amount of street credibility in talking to the ANC. And he was the one, after the Kissinger people packed up and left, who went racing around trying to figure out what would get Buthelezi to participate in the election. What would get Inkatha to participate? And they wanted various guarantees for the Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini. They wanted protections of property in KwaZulu-Natal. They wanted a variety of assurances that they were going to have some say in the politics. And so it was this crisis management and shuttle diplomacy that diffused the violence that you saw in the final run-up to the election. There were also just massive issues of election mechanics. So one interesting tidbit here is because the election date was non-negotiable, it had to occur in April, or the country would have really descended into a complete civil war. The ballots had already been printed when it was clear that Inkatha was not going to participate. And finally, virtually Coleman and others had gotten Inkatha to agree to virtually all, gotten the government and the ANC to agree to virtually all of Inkatha's demands. But one of their ones, they said, we've got to push the election back because we haven't been campaigning. And so they wanted to push the election back. And of course, both the government and the ANC knew that that was a non-starter. And so finally, they were confronted with the problem, again, tiny things. The person who said, don't let small things bother you, has never spent a night in a tent with a mosquito. So the problem was that the National Party was on the bottom of the ballot, and they had been campaigning on the slogan, vote the bottom line, vote the bottom line. But there was no other place to put a stick-on the ballots. And these stick-ons had to be printed, in record time, and got into this is a developing country. It's not, I know we have our issues with butterfly ballots and election interfering and all that, but this was a huge logistical operation. So first, the National Party had to be convinced that it was so dangerous not to have Inkatha on the ballot that they had to, notwithstanding their vote the bottom line slogan on all their literature, that they had to, there was no other place for the stick-on, had to go there. Then the stick-ons had to be printed, they had to be flown around the country. Business played a role in all of that. And so you get the election result. And the election, as I said to you last time, was widely declared to be free and fair. And there's a wrinkle to that, though, that's always struck me, though I've never seen reporting on it, which is that the election results took several days to, finally, often the case, and when you've got paper ballots being counted by hand. It took 3 or 4 days to get the final election results. But at the end of the first day, it was declared that Inkatha had won KwaZulu-Natal regional parliament, and that they had enough votes for 3 seats in the cabinet. And so, I could never prove it, but I have a sneaking suspicion that that part of the election result was negotiated in advance of the election. Building civil society support. Again here, business worked with church groups and others to put together hundreds and hundreds of meetings where they would come and talk about scenarios. They would come and talk about how the economy might unfold in the future, and they would do this as part of their effort to influence the ANC, which, by the way, they succeeded in doing. When the ANC came to power, it still articulated a pretty staunch socialist economic program. They had a manifesto called Reconstruction and Development, and it talked about nationalization. Mandela's first international visit when he came out of prison was to Cuba, heavily criticized by the Americans. But within months of coming to power, the ANC had largely repudiated its RDP, Reconstruction and Development Plan, and instead embraced something called GEAR, growth in economic reconstruction, growth, I've kind of what it stood for, but basically it was a shift to the Washington Consensus to a very large extent. It basically put off massive transformation of the economy, the effects of which I'll talk about briefly in a minute. They created an election fund. They helped with the logistics of the election and ensured that the elections would be free and fair. So, quite a remarkable story in many ways. Business does not normally behave in this way. And there were undeniably notable achievements. The first is that they avoided the catastrophe. I think that it is a fair retrospective judgment that but for the things that business was able to do, both in creating relationships and networks, in serving as, through the consultative business movement, convener of talks, and then picking up the pieces when they repeatedly failed, helping to manage the spoilers and getting them to participate. In all of those ways, there were important achievements. They really did help abolish apartheid in a peaceful way, ended the country's pariah status, and had a lot to do with the resurgence of the economy. This was the era when people were talking about the BRIC countries, right? Brazil, India, China, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They started talking about the BRICS because South Africa had a big economic resurgence. If you look at sort of macroeconomic and social indicators, in the first 12 years or so, the number of people living in poverty went down, not in a non-trivial way, and they did create a black middle class. Between 1995 and 2009, R500 million was, and that was when the rand was worth a lot more than it is today, was transferred from the white business to black business. So in all of these respects, you could say there was a significant achievement. And business deserves considerable credit, some of these business leaders, for taking big risks and being willing to do what they did. But on the other side of the ledger, there are pretty challenging legacies of the way things unfolded. We still have a limited democracy, single-party dominant democracy, as I talked about last week. Those tend to be very corrupt. South Africa is not special in this. Go to Russia, go to Mexico, go to India for a long time, single-party dominant system. Very, very high levels of corruption come with single-party dominant systems. The politically entrenched labor movement has been very costly for the country over time because it protects, and this is the South African variant of the story we're talking about in Germany and in the advanced capitalist countries earlier in the course. We have a very high wage economy in the formal sector, but we have huge unemployment. We have 30% unemployment and almost 50% youth unemployment, one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the world. South Africa hemorrhages textile jobs to Lesotho, even to China. So you have the downstream effects of this very powerful, entrenched, organized labor movement that's wired into the government. And by the way, that all exploded in 2012 at a platinum mine in a place called Marikana, where again, ironically, in view of the 1970s, wildcat strikes were organized against the unions and existing managements for sweetheart deals that they believed were excluding them. And about 34, I think it was, people were shot dead by the police, many in the back. Huge blot on Cyril Ramaphosa's character, because it made it much harder for him to win the ANC leadership in 2018, because he was one of the directors of Marikana mine. Since the transition, business is completely disengaged. While they were very proactive at this time of crisis, it's much harder to get people's attention for a chronic problem than for a crisis. And after the transition, South Africa's problems went back from being crisis to chronic. The inequality, the poverty, the lack of racial integration, except for elites. And so if you look, this is a Lorenz curve, which a Lorenz curve is just another way of depicting the Gini coefficient measure of inequality. You can see the dotted line is 2009, the blue line is 1996. So in the first decade and a half after apartheid, the overall structure of inequality in the economy has not changed. And a decade later, it would be much different. This was in the Wall Street Journal, for now, 4 years ago now, but these numbers wouldn't look substantially different today. On the left-hand column there, you can see, again, Gini coefficients. You can see South Africa is one of the most unequal countries, even decades after the end of apartheid, in the world. It's actually got the highest Gini coefficient of countries for which we have data. That doesn't mean the highest in the world. I suspect if we had data for places like Saudi Arabia, it might have a higher Gini coefficient. But in any event, it's basically 0.7, enormously unequal, even more unequal than you can see there than countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. So unemployment, I already told you the story, but you break unemployment down by race, and you can see that a third of the black population is unemployed. Half of the black youth unemployment population is unemployed. If you look at other social indicators, if you look at people living in poverty, half the black population is still living in poverty. Adults with high school only education. Again, you've got 15% of that black population has a high school education. Private health insurance, and the public health insurance is not very good. 10% of the black population. Indoor plumbing. We're living in the richest country in Africa this is in 2014, but it's not much different today. A third of the black population does not have indoor plumbing. And so, this is one way of saying that good things don't all go together. So they avoided a civil war. The outcome really would have been catastrophic. I think very few historians would dispute the proposition that hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people would have been killed, and it would have gone on for a long time, and it's not clear at all what would have come out of the other end of it. But we are in a world in which there's very substantial disillusionment as politics now normalizes and the revolutionary generation passes from the scene and we face the run-of-the-mill problems that many developing countries face. Cyril Ramaphosa, you saw him as a young man in that very first video that I showed when he was a leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, and then COSATU, finally the chief negotiator for the ANC, and he was worried when, in that video talking about being shot at. You know, his story is a very interesting depiction of the interaction between business and politics in South Africa over time. He begins as an ANC activist. He then becomes the head of the National Union of Mine Workers and COSATU, eventually the Secretary General of COSATU and chief negotiator for the ANC. He was edged out of the succession to Mandela by Mbeki when he was the heir apparent, so he decided to go off and get rich. He became South Africa's first black billionaire, hugely successful. Then he came back into politics as Zuma's deputy, and in a very bitter fight, finally won the leadership of the ANC. But would be another entire lecture to go through the slenderness of his grip on the ANC, which is partly a result of the way in which it's governed. But that will be a topic for later in the course. Next, we will be talking about the ICC and the doctrine of responsibility to protect.